In the early modern period, as Europe underwent its spiritual and social convulsions, it also experienced another transformation. When Europeans began crossing the Atlantic to colonize the so-called New World, they brought with them not only their religion and customs, but also their paranoia and brutality. American settlers, though far from the old world monarchies and papal courts, would manifest new waves of religious persecution, their colonial project marking the beginnings of a dark and bloody story of conquest. Driven by an imperialist mindset, the early settlers in America would lay the groundwork for a murderous expansion of empire across the country. This violence and thirst for domination would also turn itself inward, culminating in witch hunts and executions, the most infamous being the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. Puritanism, a significant force in shaping early American history, took root in New England in the early 17th century. Landing in Massachusetts in 1620, these pilgrims preached a model of moral purity and devout Christian living, emphasizing hard work, education, and a close-knit community governed by a rigid code of ethics. Their theocratic style of governance, which blurred the line between church and state, laid the groundwork for both religious freedom but also fierce intolerance. At the heart of the witch trials in colonial America was the Puritan worldview, espoused by English Protestants who sought to rid the Church of England of what they saw as remnants of Roman Catholicism. Strangely, their thought processes seemed to align when it came to women and the supernatural. The Puritans were fervent in their desire to create a society based on their strict interpretation of the Bible and Calvinist theology of predestination. Those who would be granted salvation were already chosen. It was God's will only that decided the fate of mankind, and they, coincidentally, happened to be in His good graces. They envisioned building a city on a hill, which would pose as a beacon of light to the world, seeing the American wilderness as both a land of divine promise and a realm fraught with spiritual peril. This untamed wilderness became symbolic of the unknown and, to the Puritans, a breeding ground for the diabolical. In their ignorance and grandiose sense of righteousness, this community believed spiritual dominance was essential to the creation of what they imagined to be a civilized world. This religiosity was intensified by the hardship and instability of colonial life. Isolated from the wider world, surrounded by an environment they did not fully understand, and living in close-knit communities bound by strict doctrine, Puritans were especially susceptible to fears of supernatural and physical threats. The devil was not an abstract figure, but a real and present force. In a world of disease, crop failure, and hostile relations with indigenous people, the Puritan mind imagined a reality where Satan sought to destroy them from all angles. This intense anxiety eventually found its focus in witchcraft. In Europe, witches were accused of wielding malevolent powers to bring about societal ills. In America, where life was perilous and survival precarious, these consternations were amplified. The belief that the devil was conspiring to undermine the fragile religious order of the colonies found its mark, and accusations of witchcraft began to multiply. The religious ideology that drove the witch hunts did not take root in a vacuum. America, by the late 1600s, was already a land of profound violence and upheaval. Colonization of the New World had been a process marked by displacement, subjugation, and the near extermination of indigenous peoples. European settlers, in their drive to claim land, resources, and dominance, waged a relentless campaign of violence against Native American tribes. The tribes, also a warring people, were not ready to lay down with ease, and raids on the settlements were common, resulting in bloody conflicts and ongoing disputes between the tribes and their colonial enemies. This was the landscape of 17th century North America, a power struggle in which entire civilizations were eventually destroyed through war, disease, and forced ethnic cleansing. Colonists viewed the indigenous not just as political and military enemies, but as spiritual adversaries. In their eyes, Native Americans were sometimes cast as agents of the devil, part of the wilderness that had to be tamed and converted or wiped out. For many settlers, this mission was ordained by God. Threats to the flourishing of this new civilization were not just from outside forces. For the Puritans, evil and chaos could infiltrate their communities internally by way of spiritual attack. In the winter of 1692, the small Puritan settlement of Salem, Massachusetts, became the scene of one of the most infamous episodes of mass hysteria in American history. Over the course of several months, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft. What began as a group of young girls exhibiting strange, convulsive behavior soon spiraled into a community-wide panic. The hysteria began in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village, when his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to suffer from mysterious fits. They would scream, contort their bodies, and speak in tongues, symptoms the Puritans believed to be signs of demonic possession. The local doctor, unable to find a medical explanation, pointed to witchcraft, and the accusations soon followed. As word spread, more young girls in the village began exhibiting similar symptoms, including Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott. 3 women were initially accused by the girls: Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Parris household; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, a widow who had been involved in a land dispute. Under pressure, some accounts say she was whipped by the Reverend Parris. Tituba confessed to practicing witchcraft and claimed to be in league with other women throughout the village, igniting a wildfire of paranoia. Her confession seemed to confirm the community's worst fears. Witches were among them. The social status of the first 3 accused points to the community of Salem's inherent prejudices. The afflicted girls were conditioned into seeing these women as undesirables, to be looked down upon and presented as examples of what the girls did not want to grow into in their adult years. Tituba, a second-class citizen who harbored some imagined dark powers, a racist stereotype upheld by the community at the time. Sarah Osborne, a woman past her prime, a widower who had chosen to upset the social norms by taking control of her husband's farm after he died. A woman blocking the orderly transmission of property to her sons, the next generation of males. Sarah Good, a woman in poverty, a beggar and burden on society. Good represented a failed life, someone open to satanic temptation as a way to transform her miserable reality. Good and Osborne denied the charges, something that would prove fatal to both women. After the trials, it became clear that the majority of those found guilty and executed were people who chose to tell the truth and not crumble beneath the weight of interrogation, while many of those who admitted to the accusations were eventually acquitted. As more young girls came forward displaying afflictions, further accusations follow. The net was now cast wider. Rebecca Nurse, a pious elderly woman from a prominent family; Martha Corrie, a respected church member; Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, a landowner in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and vocal critic of the trials. These women differed, being of higher standing in the community. Behind the accusations of witchcraft, it seemed there was a patchwork of motivations developing, from prejudice and fear of being ostracized, to envious personal vendettas and disputes among families and political adversaries. Many of the girls turned accusers were orphans from a war in the north with Native American tribes, and saw themselves taken into homes that were probably more intensely pious than the northern frontier families to which they had been born. Their position rendered them slightly adrift, their futures unsure. It was thought they turned to older women in the village for fortune-telling. When one girl reportedly conjured a vision of a coffin rather than a husband and family, she became unhinged and turned accuser. As the accusations continued, Massachusetts Governor William Phips responded by establishing a special court in May 1692 to handle the trials. The court was led by prominent figures, mostly judges, all men. The court's reliance on spectral evidence, testimony that the spirit or spectre of the accused appeared to the witnesses in a dream or vision and was seen committing witchcraft, became a hallmark of the trials, despite its highly subjective and unreliable nature. Puritans believed that physical realities had spiritual causes, and that if someone claimed to have seen a ghost or spirit in the form of the accused, that person must be a witch. Spectral evidence was particularly dangerous. It was intangible and could not be verified by multiple witnesses or refuted by the accused. During her confession, Tituba described visions of the devil and claimed that the spectres of witches, both her own and others, appeared to her. She described being visited by a tall man from Boston, interpreted as the devil. Abigail Williams, Betty Paris, Ann Putnam Jr. testified that they saw spectres of individuals like Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse pinching, choking, or biting them, even though these women were not physically present at the time of the alleged attacks. Elizabeth Hubbard claimed that the spectre of George Burroughs, a former minister, appeared before her performing feats of supernatural strength. Ann Putnam Jr. played a prominent role in the trials, providing evidence against several accused witches. She claimed that the spectres of Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corrie attacked her, tormenting her in visions and urging her to sign the Devil's Book. Mercy Lewis provided detailed evidence against George Burroughs, claiming that his spectre appeared to her and tortured her. She also testified that Burroughs' spectre boasted about killing his previous wives, and that she had witnessed him performing satanic rituals in the form of visions. Elizabeth Proctor, John Proctor's wife, was accused of witchcraft alongside him. The afflicted girls testified that her spectre attacked them during court proceedings, choking and biting them, even as she physically stood before the court denying the charges. The accused were interrogated, often in front of large crowds. Key players in the trials included Reverend Cotton Mather, a prominent minister who supported the proceedings, and Thomas Putnam, a well-off landowner whose family made numerous accusations, often targeting those with whom they had land disputes. Once underway, the trials and convictions moved at a rapid pace, seeing several hundred people passing through the courts. Tituba was eventually pardoned, possibly because She had never denied the charges and chose to name other women as witches. She was held in captivity along with others while the verdicts were reached and was later sold off to another family as a way to cover her jail expenses. The first to hang was a widow called Bridget Bishop at Gallows Hill, followed by Sarah Good, the beggar, and Rebecca Nurse, the respected, God-fearing mother of 8. George Burroughs, the minister, could not save himself, even though he recited the Lord's Prayer in the courtroom, a feat thought to be impossible for a witch. John Proctor rallied against the illegitimacy of the trials throughout, attempting to move his trial out of Salem. He failed, was convicted, and hung. Martha Carrier, accused of causing an outbreak of smallpox, was labelled a rampant hag and a queen of hell. She protested her innocence unsuccessfully and was hung. John Willard, a deputy who expressed doubt about the legitimacy of spectral evidence, was seized upon, found guilty, and hung. Sarah Wilds, known to have multiple run-ins with the law, was snatched up, accused of spectral torment, and put to death. After he would not plead, Giles Corey, an English-born farmer, was asked to strip naked and lay down, face up on the ground. A wooden board was then placed on top of him, and on top of the board, one by one, a sheriff placed large rocks. After 2 days of this torture, through which Giles had remained silent, never crying out, he was asked to plead again. He never pled either way. On the 3rd day, 19th of September 1692, he died from being pressed to death. The bodies piled up, the trials and executions running from June 1692 through to September. The final victim being Mary Easty, who had been released and recaptured when afflicted girls said her spectre continued to torment them. Despite widespread belief in her innocence and a petition signed by over 30 community members on her behalf, Easty was convicted and hanged on the 22nd of September. In total, 19 people were put to death, mostly by hanging, but some dying in prison, including Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused. The fact that the majority of the afflicted individuals during the Salem Witch Trials were young girls has been a subject of historical debate, and several theories have been proposed to explain why this group became the main accusers. Puritan communities placed great emphasis on female modesty, obedience, and piety. Young girls were expected to be quiet, deferential, and submissive to the authority of men and older women. Expressing rebelliousness or dissatisfaction openly could be dangerous and lead to punishment. For these girls, experiencing afflictions such as fits, trances, or visions provided a socially acceptable way to express inner conflicts, fears, and frustrations. In a deeply religious society where the devil and his agents were seen as ever-present threats, claiming to be attacked by witchcraft or the devil allowed the girls to channel their anxieties into a socially acknowledged narrative. Being afflicted gave them a temporary form of attention and power. Young girls, like others in the community, were subjected to immense social and psychological stress. As colonizers of native land, the Puritans had placed their community in a perilous situation. Anxiety was high. The experience of having fits or convulsions or feeling tormented by invisible forces may have been a response to the overwhelming pressure they felt. Mass hysteria or psychosomatic illness has been suggested as a possible explanation. The young girls may have unconsciously imitated each other's behaviours, and in a highly charged environment, the afflictions spread quickly. Harking back to the teachings of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Puritans believed women, and especially young women, to be more susceptible to the devil's temptations, because they were seen as spiritually weaker and more prone to sin than men. Young girls were often viewed as being on the front lines of this cosmic struggle between good and evil. The idea that the devil could target them through witches or demonic possession was not only plausible but expected in such a worldview. Some historians and scholars have suggested possible medical explanations for the girls' symptoms, though these theories remain speculative. One of the most famous suggestions is the ergot poisoning theory, proposed by historian Linda Corporeal in the 1970s. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye. When ingested, it can cause symptoms such as hallucinations, convulsions, and delusions. Rye was a staple crop in Colonial, Massachusetts. The trials began to lose momentum when prominent figures, including William Phips, the governor of Massachusetts, questioned the legitimacy of spectral evidence. This had become an issue over time and was parroted by many members of the community. One of the key turning points came when prominent and respected individuals like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor were accused and executed. The absurdity of the accusations against upstanding members of the community caused some to reconsider whether innocent people were being wrongly convicted. This was, of course, a rank hypocrisy. The Puritans fashioned themselves as highly moral Christians. Their charity, however, did not seem to extend to everyone in society. Religious leaders outside Salem also voiced their opposition to the brutality of the executions. A pamphlet written by Increase Mather, an influential minister, stated, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned." Recognizing the hysteria and the potential damage to the colony, Phips ultimately intervened, dissolving the special court in October 1692 and prohibiting further arrests. Phips also worked to free the remaining prisoners still held on charges of witchcraft. By May 1693, the trials had effectively ended, and most of the accused were either released or acquitted. There was a significant public backlash. Many began to see the events as a terrible miscarriage of justice, and several key figures involved in the trials expressed their regret for their roles. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, publicly confessed to his guilt in 1697, and other officials later followed suit. The Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching, also known as a day of humiliation, to repent for the errors made during the trials. The end did not erase the trauma and loss experienced, but it left a lasting legacy in American history. The trials became a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, religious extremism, and the collapse of due process. One of the most enduring aspects of the Salem Witch Trials is their association with mass hysteria. Reason was overpowered by fear and superstition. Neighbours turned against one another, and mere accusations were enough to condemn individuals to death. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, written in 1953 during the height of McCarthyism, used the events of 1692 as an allegory for the anti-communist hysteria of the time. The play remains one of the most powerful dramatizations of the dangers of moral panic, ensuring that the trials continue to be studied as part of American literary and cultural history. The term witch hunt is frequently invoked in contemporary politics to describe situations where individuals or groups are unjustly targeted by irrational fears. Salem highlighted how these fears can be manipulated by authorities to consolidate power, evident in global politics today, where fear, whether of terrorism, communism, or immigration, is regularly exploited for political gain. If the public is supplied with a target, they will take aim. By tapping into the deep-seated anxieties, leaders or groups rally support and suppress dissent, much like the Puritan authorities who sanctioned the witch trials. Scapegoats are created when those in power are failing in their duties, and the outcomes are often catastrophic.